Good afternoon. I'm David Uy, Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum, DC, the first and only museum in our nation's capital dedicated to the Chinese American story. On today's menu is a historical and sensory exploration of Chinese cuisine with Fuchsia Dunlop, a James Beard award-winning food writer and cook specializing in Chinese cuisine. Our main course is her latest book, Invitation to a Banquet, the story of Chinese food. And joining the conversation with Fuchsia is Lin-Liu, culinary journalist, events director, and culinary consultant at Chang Chang, a restaurant by Peter Chang here in Washington, D.C. She is the author of two culinary memoirs, Serve the People, A Stir-Fried Journey Through China, and On the Noodle Road from Beijing to Rome with Love and Pasta. This program is made possible with the support of the Ruth H. Kuo and Rhoda Howe Memorial Foundation. And as I mentioned before we started, just a quick housekeeping note. This is a webinar format, so you will not be on camera, but you can ask questions through the Q&A feature, and we will do our best to get to your questions and comments. So Fuchsia and Jen, welcome. So nice to have you here. And Fuchsia, I know it's late at night in England, so.
Yes, at least I just managed to switch the video on again, which I was doubtful about for a moment.
These victories. So I forgot how we're going to start. Jen, did you?
Yeah, I'm happy to get started. Just lovely to see you again, Fuchsia and David. I feel like Fuchsia and I have had an ongoing conversation about Chinese food that spans maybe decades now. So it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you. I guess I wanted to start because you first you recently published your Invitation to a Banquet that recently came out in the UK and the United States. This lovely, beautiful book here. I guess my cover's it's blurred here, but I just wanted to know, you've been on a book tour for quite a few weeks, maybe months now. So what was that first dish that you had, Chinese dish that you had when you got back to the UK?
Well, it was one version of my emergency noodles. So I always I buy these really nice fresh Fujianese made noodles in London, and then I put them in the freezer. And so on this occasion, beautiful noodles with a Sichuanese spicy kind of strange flavor sauce, which takes about 5 minutes to make, and it's really delicious with some silken tofu.
Oh, that sounds amazing. That sounds amazing. And maybe one of the best dishes you probably had even across all of your journeys. So when we last spoke, I guess privately, I had asked you, I had started asking you about something that I had noticed personally about you, which was that up until about a year ago, I lived in Beijing, and there was a page one bookstore in Qianmen that I would frequent, and I noticed that one of the times that I went there most recently, in between the Xi Jinping thought books, was your memoir translated into Chinese. And then I heard all of my Chinese friends gushing about Fuxia and how you have made such an impact on China, on Chinese readers who are really excited about you. Can you talk a little bit about what that experience has been like?
Well, it was a complete surprise because I never imagined that any of my books would be published in Chinese. So the way I understood it was that I was writing about China for people who were outside China and didn't know much about it and who weren't Chinese. And gradually I've become aware that a lot of the readers in the West are, often of Chinese heritage and all different kinds of backgrounds. And then in 2000, when was it? In 2018, Shark's Fin and Sichuan Pepper, my memoir, was finally published in China. And yes, it's been very popular, and a lot of I've done sort of reader events in China, and people seem to find it very interesting, an outsider's view of something that's very familiar to them. And so a lot of people have said that as a foreigner, I notice things that they'd taken for granted. Like, I'm very interested in the subject of texture. And that's something that's totally instinctive to Chinese people, but they don't necessarily think that it's such an important part of Chinese cuisine. It's just there in the background of daily lives. And also, I think a lot of young Sichuanese people have enjoyed the rather romantic and nostalgic descriptions of the Chengdu that I fell in love with in the 1990s, which has mostly been redeveloped, and so many of these old customs have disappeared. And yeah, and it's also become a strange story about people fulfilling their dreams, because young Chinese people are under so much academic pressure from their parents, having to get into good schools. And so people find it a bit fascinating that I went to an excellent university and then I just did what I had always wanted to do, which is cook. And quite a few Chinese readers have asked me if my parents were devastated when, having sent me to Cambridge, I then went to a cooking school. And of course, they didn't mind. So yeah, it's been a great pleasure. And I find it very interesting, the kind of discussions that it stimulates about cultural difference and food, and what Chinese food is, and Chinese perceptions of Western food as well.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that the attitude of having gone to a good university, and it's a parent's worst nightmare, of course, a Chinese parent's worst nightmare if you end up in a Chinese kitchen. So
But I think it's one of the really puzzling contradictions of Chinese culture that, everyone is so interested in food. It's a culture that's really centered on food and gastronomy. And yet there's this traditional divide between the intellectuals and the esteemed scholarly types and the
yeah,
people actually doing the cooking, who are also
absolutely.
skilled practitioners of Chinese culture, but they don't necessarily have the esteem that they should have.
Yeah, I mean, it's the food is vaunted. Everybody is, a chauvinist in China when it comes to Chinese food, but there is this gap, and I guess that's where you and I come in, where we are able to have value because we are somehow the transmitters of between high and low culture and between different cultures.
But I have to say, I think,
Yeah.
I mean, it's maybe your experience as well, but it seems to me that in America and in Britain, it's very noticeable. There's a younger generation of Chinese people who grew up abroad or maybe were educated, outside China, and who don't have that prejudice, and who are now, there are people in London who came here to study and have now opened noodle restaurants. So things are shifting a bit.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think for every Chinese chef, their worst nightmare for their child is for them to become a chef, for their, they don't want that for their next generation. But I think you point out in your new book that if that is the case, then how do we pass on these traditions? And that's something that worries you, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I hear the same story. I mean, it's anecdotally, just among my friends and acquaintances, I just see so much an elder generation who are hugely skilled in the kitchen. So, like in Sichuan, men and women really knowing how to cook well, the elder generation. And when I first lived in China in the 1990s, everybody shopped pretty much every day in fresh produce markets, farmers markets. And people could not only cook, but they could also make pickles and make sausages and cure winter meats. And the younger generation are very noticeably not really learning all this. I think in lockdown there was a bit more cooking, and cooking is becoming popular as a leisure activity, but it might be Western baking as much as making mapo tofu. And just professionally, I mean, I know several really exceptional chefs who I think if they were in the West would have queues of people wanting to do stages in their kitchen, wanting to study from them. And they find it really hard to find young people who are sufficiently committed to really want to apply themselves to learning the culinary arts. And that's something that I've been hearing for years all over China.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is a hard life too, right? We have to admit that working in a kitchen is not for everyone.
Yeah, and I think with Chinese cooking too, I mean, wok cooking, as you know, is a particularly intense form of cooking. I mean, it's probably that all the fire and heat is a bit like being a grill chef in the West,
Mm.
but it's 10 times as complex and subtle and requires all these sort of split second judgments and, you know, adding seasonings. You have to be absolutely precise. There's no time for error, no time to reconsider. It's not like tasting a French sauce where you can add a little more lemon or a little more salt. With a stir fry, it's really, really fast and intense. And I
It's
think, yeah,
brutal.
as you said, many of the older chefs, I mean, they did really quite brutal apprenticeships, and many of them started cooking in their teens. They spent years doing menial tasks,
Hmm.
and it took years before they were really accomplished wok chefs. So it is quite intimidating. I can see that, but
Hmm.
it's glorious as well. I mean,
Yeah.
when I see a good wok chef, it's like watching a martial artist. The
Yes,
grace, the precision, the judgment. It's amazing.
absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about your new book. What I'm sure you've gotten all the same questions on your book tour. So I'm curious to just find out what you discovered new about your book while you were on your book tour. What kind of revelations did you have?
Well, one thing that was quite interesting was that, I mean, I wrote it as a book to be read chronologically. So it's a series of chapters, and each chapter is centered on a particular Chinese dish that I feel expresses something very profound about Chinese culinary culture. But the book is structured so that you start with the really fundamental historical roots of Chinese cuisine, and I think some of the core characteristics of it. Things like food as medicine, which has been absolutely central to Chinese cuisine since the beginning of Britain's civilization, really. And then it progresses through looking at ingredients and then cooking methods and then ideas about food and food in society. But one of the things that I discovered on the book tour was quite a few people have been reading it as a sort of pick and mix, dipping in and just reading a chapter here and there. And I just found that interesting because you certainly can read it like that, but it's not what I thought I was doing.
Yeah, I have to say that I kind of got that feel from it. I did read it chronologically, but I did feel like it was almost like kind of the way that dishes in a Chinese banquet can be served in different sequences.
Yes, well, true.
Like
Yeah.
there's really no order to a Chinese meal, and sometimes that irks Westerners. But I did get that sense that that it was something really pleasurable to dip in and out of. Yeah, that came through for sure. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Um, so you do also talk about how you wanted this to be a narrative. Did you also write this during COVID? Was that part of kind of
Yeah.
the
So I've
impetus?
been thinking about doing a book like this for several years, and I'm always writing in journals and diaries and notebooks. And so I had some of the material, and some of it came out of articles that I'd written. But I sat down and wrote the proposal during the first British lockdown, which was when was it? In the spring of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And then I worked on it through the pandemic. And so the thing, of course, that was really unusual about this period, I mean, I know for everyone and for me personally, was that I was grounded. And so for the first time in years, I was not able to visit China. And so I was missing people and places and food terribly. And I feel that that feeling of, missing it has gone into, the affection for, remembering people and wanting to write about them and so on. It's full of
Right.
memories,
I
that book.
mean, it fundamentally shifted your life, COVID did, right? Because you had been going to China on a very regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same for everyone, isn't it? We all had to radically rethink. But I mean, it was rather wonderful in a sense to be forced to stay in one place and think and actually write the book because it would have been, I had originally thought that I would travel around collecting stories for the book and, having a plan and then doing it. But in fact, I had everything that I needed because, I have been thinking about this subject for 30 years and I had so many thoughts about it already. That I think there was one gap, which was I terribly wanted to include this fascinating and fabulous Cantonese dish, xiazi youpi, the pomelo pith,
Mm,
braised pomelo pith with
you did
shrimp
mention it.
eggs.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the dishes of the chapters. And because I was unable to go to Hong Kong or China, a fantastic Hong Kong friend of mine actually arranged for a cooking lesson and a discussion with a Hong Kong chef. So I
Oh,
did that
cool.
bit of research remotely during
Oh,
during a
wow.
lockdown, which was great.
Wow.
But apart from that, everything else was already it's sort of in place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I find also what's really interesting is how the food almost takes the place of, or takes a much more prominent role, of course, than the people in the book. And I assume that that's on purpose because you want the food to be front and center. So I mean, is that how you thought of it?
Well, I suppose that it's trying to, the purpose of the book is to try and ask what is Chinese food and what does it mean and what makes it Chinese and how can we eat it with greater appreciation. So that was the sort of subject of the book, and that was the concern of the book. And of course, it's all about the people I met and the teachers and the people who showed me things, but it wasn't fundamentally a story about particular people. It was looking at this subject.
Mm-hmm. And what's your writing
Although,
routine
although,
like?
there,
Yeah.
although I was saying, obviously, there are some people who keep coming up, like Dai
Yes.
Jianjun, the owner
Yeah,
of the Dragonwell Manor, because
that's
he
right.
was
In
been such a
Hangzhou.
big influence
Yeah,
on my education for the last few years. Yeah.
right. And what is your writing process?
Well, I suppose that I have many, many notebooks. I mean, 150, 160, 70 notebooks now, which I've been keeping since the 1990s. And
Uh-huh.
they're all full of recipes and observations and ideas. And so I find that I really try to give a vivid sense of place. So if I'm writing, like there's a scene, for example, when I'm describing Dai Jianjun in a field on his farm,
Mhm.
and I wrote the details of that in a notebook at the time, because I find that although you can construct a chapter and you can write a lot from memory, it really helps to have all those little cues about what it really felt like, what the plants were, what was growing and what the sounds and smells were like. And particularly with food, to actually, sometimes I get very intensely involved in that. I was almost like a ridiculous sort of parody of myself when I was last in Hong Kong, because I went and had this pig's foot noodle soup in Hong Kong. And for some reason, it just inspired about 3 pages of writing, because I was just trying to describe the sensory experience of eating this lovely, voluptuous pig's foot and this beautiful broth and these kind of taut noodles, and just trying to describe the sensory experience of it and how it made me feel. So anyway, so I have all this material in my notebooks, and by now I know the more the better. The more I write down in the place, the more thankful I am later. And then also there's a certain amount of book research. I really want to try and get the details accurate. And in this one also, because it's a bit about Chinese culinary history. So there are some really magnificent works of scholarship, like the H.T. Huang, who wrote a book about food science and fermentation as part of the Needham History of Science and Civilization in China, which is just amazing resource.
Mhm.
And some other books like that, which, more academic. And then the actual writing process, I think like many writers, I feel that I'm not completely in control of it, and that sometimes writing comes easily and sometimes it's a nightmare and I think I can't do it and I'll never be able to do it again. And it's a little unpredictable. So to a certain extent, you just have to put in the hours and write. But also, I think it's important to know when to take a break and just go and look at an art exhibition or go for a walk, because there's sometimes it can, if you feel making no progress. But I suppose that I tend to sort of write as much as possible in a sort of first draft, and then there's a lot of I think of it a bit like ironing out all the creases. So then going back to the rough draft and going over and over it again and trying to make sure that the language flows. I sometimes read it aloud as well. I like the sentences to sort of sound nice as well. And then just going over it again. But I think the most important thing is, I'm sure you'll know this, is to just get something down on the page, because until you have something down on the page, you don't have anything to work with, really. It's just all hot air.
That's right. Yeah.
But I have to say that this book was, when I wrote Shark's Fin and Sichuan Pepper, which was my first narrative book, it was a complete nightmare. And I had this, at some point during the process, I almost gave up because I just felt I could not do it. And with this book, it was, of course, there were tricky bits and struggles, but it didn't feel so impossible. And in some sense, it's so very different from writing a cookbook, because with a cookbook, there's the writing and research. And the writing, to an extent, is easier because the structure of the cookbook is a bit more predictable. So it's a collection of recipes. And with this book, but then you have all the recipe testing, which is exhausting and messy and unpredictable. And the dish might come right the first time, or you might have to do it 20 times till it's satisfactory. And so with a narrative book, the actual work, it's a bit more clear cut what one has to do, like just write, not recipe testing. But at the same time, it's more challenging because it can be anything you want. I mean, how do you structure it? Well, you're just trying to bring something out of thin air. There's no sort of off the peg idea like a cookbook, for example.
What do you prefer? Which one do you prefer?
Well, I think they're both interesting in their own way. But I have to say that it will be nice to get back in the kitchen. The next book will be a cookbook, and it's also fun to do all the recipe testing and stuff. So I think I eat better, and all my friends and family eat better when I'm doing a cookbook from when I'm doing a book.
So what is the next book?
Oh, well, it's a cookbook, but I never like to talk about the book before it's actually written, because I think I'll just talk it out and never get around to writing it.
I've actually heard the opposite, that you need to that I needed to tell everybody what I was doing, otherwise I would chicken out and not do it.
Well, I suppose that it helps to tell people you are writing a book, because then you're committed. What else did I want to say? And I really, really want to emphasize to everybody who's out there who has not gotten a copy of it, or please do read it. And I think really one amazing point of it is that we spoke about this I think a couple times ago when we talked, is that you're really trying to see things from the point of view of someone Chinese and explain that to a Western audience. You're this kind of intermediary between these two worlds, and just trying to get the point out there that you're adventurous, you plunge in, you have 3 pages in this book describing textures, I think maybe more than 3 pages of words, and explanations of what those words mean. And your appreciation and love and respect for China and its food really just comes across in the book. Thank you so much. That's very lovely. Thanks.
Yeah. And I have to also mention sort of the erotic type descriptions you have in there, and just how can you talk a little bit about the eroticism of the way you describe Chinese dishes?
Well, there's that famous quote from the philosopher Gaozi, which says that food and sex are human nature, 食色性也. And I think that one of the glorious things about Chinese civilization is this uninhibited delight in physical pleasure, and that includes food and the sensory pleasures of food. And so on the one hand, I really want to write about the food in a way that makes people feel it in some way. You know, what's it like? And also particularly with textures, which a lot of Westerners find tricky aspect of Chinese food. To write about textures in a way that is, you know, slippery, slimy, crunchy, gristly foods, to write in them in a way that is very vivid and is quite fun and has fun with people's issues about it, but also makes them sound really exciting and delicious. And I think there is a real overlap to writing about sort of erotic things and writing about food. And I think I have a lot of fun with it. And
You
I think
certainly
it's
do.
just, you know, it just makes me smile sometimes when I'm writing it. And also, frankly, I do get very carried away when eating and when writing about food. So it just happens quite naturally.
Right, right. And one thing that I found really interesting in our last talk was how you mentioned that that your parents weren't surprised by what you ended up doing, and how your mother was a very adventurous cook, and how that really impacted you. Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
how you were raised and
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I had a very unusual English 1970s upbringing, really, because I grew up in Oxford, but my mother was, for a start, always a very adventurous eater. And one of her closest friends was Indian. And so she learned some Indian dishes from him. And then she taught English as a foreign language in Oxford. And so we had always one or two of her students living with us. And this included people at various times from Japan, Turkey, Sicily. And then other bunches of students would come round for dinner parties that my mother would cook, or sometimes all the Turks would come over and make dinner in our house. And I found the other day some photos of a dinner party that my parents had when I must have been about 8 or 9. And my mother had labeled the picture with the names and countries of all the guests. And on this one evening, there were people there from Greece, Japan, Sudan, Lebanon, you know, all these different countries. And so I had exposure to a lot of different dishes from a very young age. And then my mother would often adopt some of the recipes and go on cooking them. So we used to have a traditional English Sunday lunch of a roast meat and roast potatoes, but we also ate Turkish kufta and cacık and Indian curries and Sicilian parmigiano and all these different dishes. And so, yeah, my mother claims to remember the look of utter joy that spread across my face when, as a baby, I first tasted solid food. She says she's never forgotten this. And I remember from, you know, being really very young, just loving helping my mother in the kitchen. And, you know, I can remember standing up on a chair by the stove and stirring things. And my mother would encourage me to taste and judge. And does this need any more salt or whatever it was? And then we used to go to the market and she taught me how to pick out ripe, you know, fruits and vegetables. And I just loved it. And so all my life, cooking made me happier than anything else. And I think if I hadn't grown up somewhere so academic, you know, and I was good academically, so I went to university, but I think otherwise I would probably have become a chef when I was a teenager.
Mm. Interesting.
Yeah, but of course it was that kind of adventurousness, and also we were always living with and socializing with people of different cultures. And my mother, you know, we always expected to be polite and eat things politely and so on. And so I took some of that attitude to China, which was, even when I was faced with things which at the time I found really perplexing or even completely unappealing, like goose intestines, like I would always try everything and give it a go and politely eat it up.
What about your first experience eating Chinese food? Do you remember that? You talk a little bit about the sweet and sour pork balls, of course, that
Yeah, well, I mean, probably like many Americans, many British people, my first experience at that time was a Chinese takeout food. And it was an occasional treat for the family. And we would get these, I think, foil boxes with chop suey and chow mein and so on. But the absolute treat was these sweet and sour pork balls, which I think is a very British Chinese thing. So you would get a sort of these nuggets of pork, which were dipped into a rather doughy batter and deep fried until they were golden. So these golden spheres, and then they always came with a polystyrene cup of a bright red, transparent sweet and sour sauce, and they were really delicious. And in fact, it's funny because I didn't have them for years and years and years, and then about, I don't know, a little while before the pandemic, I wrote a story about the British Chinese takeaway, and I found this amazing place in East London with a wonderful British Chinese woman who was just like this warm, like the landlady of a pub who knew everyone in the neighbourhood. And I had these very fresh and delicious sweet and sour pork balls, which took me back to being this small child. But they're not so common now because, of course, like everywhere else, we have Sichuanese restaurants now, we have Xi'an street food, and so you don't necessarily come across that sort of thing so much
So just
anymore.
going back to those pork balls, it was fried pork, and then you would dunk it into a sauce, kind of like a chicken McNugget, or what?
Yeah, exactly. Like a sort of, but not with it wasn't a sort of just a crunchy batter that clung to the shape of the chicken. It was like a ball of something doughy with a nugget of pork in it. And then you would dip it into the sauce. Yeah.
So that doesn't exist in America. Maybe there's a market for British Chinese food here.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I remember because I wrote something, an article once about sweet and sour pork, and I was trying to work out where this came from. And when I went to Chaozhou, which is this very interesting culinary region of the Cantonese south of China, just near Fujian province, they were selling these deep fried golden sort of pork and shrimp balls with a sweet sour fruity sauce. And I just wondered whether there may have been some connection, but we'll probably never know.
Yeah, it's always hard to tangle out those origins, isn't it? It's something that I've always tried to do with, varying degrees of success.
But it's funny because we also, we didn't have, General Tso's chicken, which is such a big deal on the east coast of America.
That doesn't
does
exist.
not. No, it's very much an American, it came from Taiwan to America, and one particular chef was very much associated with it. And we never had it in Britain until recently. One or two places have started doing it.
One really interesting experience I had was in Rome, where I went for Chinese food, and they served fried ice cream at the end of the meal. And we had like in America, we always associated fried ice cream with Mexican food because that was something.
Oh, really?
So it really is strange how these ideas.
Well, when I went to Sydney for the first time, I was amazed to find the mango pancake was the Chinese dessert. So it's really delicious, actually, but it's a pancake with a chunk of fresh mango and some, I think, whipped cream in it, rolled up.
Right? Kind of like a mango.
Yeah, and really delicious, but that's something that we never had in Britain. And in Sweden, they have something which I've never had, but Swedish friends have talked about. It's called Four Little Dishes, and it's a sort of set, which that's the sweet and sour pork balls, apparently, of Sweden.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah.
I'm always torn, though, because when I go somewhere like Rome, I'm always torn between, I'm quite curious about what the Chinese food would be like. But then if it's a choice between that or local Roman food, then the local food often wins out.
Yeah, that is actually very true. That's one of the really interesting things about having lived basically in China for so many years is every time I came back to the States, I would never want Chinese food. So I really knew very little about Chinese food in America up until a year and 3 months ago when I moved back full time. And I do have to say that the further and further my time out from China gets, the better the Chinese food tastes here.
Right. I remember the first time I went to America at all was with my first book, Land of Plenty, which is now published as The Food of Sichuan, but a Sichuan cookbook. And it was my first visit to America, and I was dying to eat burgers and pancakes with bacon and maple syrup and things like that. And everyone that I met wanted to take me to a Sichuanese restaurant. So I just went round. I think I went to every Sichuan restaurant in New York.
Having mediocre Sichuan food, probably. Yeah, I was actually just looking at my old Sichuan cookery cookbook from so many years ago, just reading some of the passages, and it really struck me that, you began saying Sichuanese cookery is one of the great unknown cuisines of the world. Would you still say that's true?
Absolutely not. I mean, it's not amazing because it was always obvious that everyone would love Sichuan food if they got the chance to try it. But yes, I mean, it's a real throwback, isn't it? Because when I came back from living in Sichuan, and it was about 1996 or something, and there weren't any Sichuan restaurants in London. It was pretty much, I mean, you would have a so-called Sichuan dish on the menu of a lot of Cantonese restaurants, but they were all toned down and they weren't really Sichuanese. And when I did a proposal for my first book, for a Sichuan cookbook, it was rejected by every publisher as being too niche, and they felt no one would be interested in a regional Chinese cookbook. And just that, I mean,
amazing.
Now that seems incredible, and it's only 20 something years later.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you have a lot to do with the fact that it has been popularized. I mean, your contribution has been enormous.
Well, I mean, I think my work has coincided with a whole lot of immigration from other parts of China, from Sichuan, and also just people from other regions of China who all want to eat Sichuanese food. So I think it was quite serendipitous that I was writing about it in English at the point when Westerners were actually able to, starting to be able to have a taste of it, and
Right.
perhaps also go to Sichuan and try it.
Right. And so what would you say, what do you tell people? I'm sure you get lots of young fans who say, I want to be like you. I want to do this. How do I get started? What kind of advice do you give to young people who want to follow in your path?
Well, I mean, I think that the whole landscape has changed completely. So I think when I started, and I'm sure when you started doing this too, writing about food, that people didn't really think of food writing as a profession in the same way. It wasn't as popular. We didn't have all these blogs and social media and so on. So it was much more niche thing anyway. And I think that, I mean, the really funny thing is that in retrospect, my career looks like a very logical progression, but actually it was very much ad hoc. And when I started writing about food in my notebooks in Sichuan in the autumn of 1994, when I first went to college in Chengdu, I just did it because I was interested, and I'd been writing diaries, which ended up being menus and recipes since I was a teenager. So it wasn't. And then when I went to the cooking school, it was, I just had the chance to do something that I loved, and I would never have imagined that I would be in the position that I am now. I mean, that would have seemed absurd. So I went to the cooking school, and while I was there, was thinking increasingly that it was mad that this cuisine was not known in the West. And then I had the idea of writing a cookbook, but it was all bit by bit. But I think now, I mean, firstly, I think that it's very unpredictable doing any kind of creative profession, and you really have to love it and you have to want to do it, because there are no guarantees. I've been very lucky, but it was a gamble, right? So that's one thing, that you have to really want to do it and really enjoy it. And I spent, my first book, I spent 6 years researching it, and I didn't make any money really, and I was paying for my trips to China and so on. So but I think now the whole landscape has changed, because obviously now you need to start by social media, I mean, I'm probably even out of touch myself. I'm sure it's TikTok now, but just there are whole different ways. And I think that many publishers now expect you to already have a profile by the time you put in a book proposal. So, I mean, I was pretty lucky anyway, because, I was an unknown writer. I'd done a bit of restaurant reviewing when I put in the first book proposal, but I think it's more difficult now, and you'd be expected. And also people doing supper clubs. And it's really interesting. I've now been, I'm a judge for an award for the Yan Kit So Award for writing about Asian cuisines in London. And it's very interesting how a lot of the applicants, they have a real track record. They've been running supper clubs or writing on social media. So by the time they're thinking of putting a book proposal together, they've already accomplished quite a lot in public, I mean.
Mm-hmm. What advice? I mean, you have an amazing Instagram following an account. What advice do you have about Instagram?
Well, I don't really regard myself as an expert, but I have to say, I mean, I suppose that I do it because I'm interested and I have fun with it. And sometimes people send me messages saying to Fuchsia and team, and like there is no team. It's just me with my phone in the kitchen. Um, and but I suppose what it is I think it's I find it can often be quite a light-hearted way of just saying something maybe interesting or just posting some delicious food. But I think with any, yeah, probably consistency. So I feel that um, I try not to have long gaps without posting anything. And obviously I've just had a book out, so there's been a bit of, talking about my book, but I don't want it all to feel promotional. It's just observations about life and beauty and food and delicious things. Right. And creating connections with people. And yeah, so I think of it, it's a kind of conversation, and I hope people find it interesting. But it's also just personal, and I don't really have a strategy. I just put things that I find interesting or delicious or beautiful and points that I think are interesting. And then if people want to follow, they can take it or leave it, really.
Well, you have so many followers and so many likes, so it's impressive.
It's so funny. I mean, my mother finds it absolutely extraordinary that so many people are interested in what I just have for supper.
Well, it's different when it's you versus just a random person. I mean, luckily we're in a profession where people actually care about what we eat.
Yeah. But I think one thing that people really enjoy actually is that, I mean, obviously to a certain extent, I post pictures of delicious food in restaurants, but people really seem to enjoy pictures of everyday home cooking and, ways of cooking nice food that's not necessarily complicated, that's inexpensive, that's healthy, and also really delicious. And at the same time, I really enjoy Instagram, and I think many of us did during the lockdowns, the awful pandemic period, that there was a real community, and I loved seeing people cooking recipes from my books. And it just felt that this was actually, in this very dark time, cooking was creating a community and making people happy and bringing some light into all this kind of difficult period. So yeah, I enjoyed it. And yeah, and also it was trying to connect also with China, and I got very excited. I remember after the hard lockdowns, the first time I went to a really good Chinese supermarket, it was like this vision that, almost fainted with happiness to see all these fresh Chinese vegetables. It was just really exciting. And also I went on foraging walks with this very interesting person called John the Poacher, who organizes wild plant tours of East London. And I found one particular plant, a kind of with mallows, kui cai, which is a really ancient Chinese vegetable that these days is not really eaten apart from in Sichuan and a bit in Hunan. But it's one of it's mentioned in all these classic ancient texts. And I found it growing by the canal in London.
Amazing.
So I picked some and made it into congis and soups. And I just found that so moving and wonderful.
That is so cool. Yeah. It looks like David might have some questions, or do you want me to should I be asking the questions from the audience? Okay, here we go. Okay, so the question from an audience member is Chinese American food authentic Chinese food? What is traditional versus authentic?
Well, authentic what? I mean, it's an authentic expression of the experience and history of Cantonese immigrants to America. It's part of the story of Chinese food because it was created by people from this particular region who came, starting in the 19th century, came to America and were cooking in quite tough conditions. And they invented a style of Chinese food that was accessible, that they could make with ingredients they had to hand, and that was inexpensive, and that was appealing to probably quite skeptical at the time Westerners. And it was very successful. So, of course, it's very different from what Cantonese people, even in America, were eating at home. And it's very different from food in the Cantonese south of China or anywhere in China. It is its own thing. but it has a sort of authenticity of its own as American Chinese food. And I feel also that the story of Chinese food is, I mean, it's the story of the country China, but it's also the story of Chinese immigrants in Southeast Asia and America. And it's a much broader story, really, with many fascinating facets.
And also, Chinese food is changing in China dramatically.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, a few years ago, I can't remember who it was, but I think, was it American Chinese? Anyway, some people who are from America, I think they may have been American Chinese, but they opened an American Chinese restaurant in Shanghai.
Yeah, I remember.
Was it called Fortune Cookie? Is that
I
what it
never
was
went.
called?
I only had heard about it. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was
I
a
don't know
real
if it did.
hit.
I can't imagine it did well.
No, it was very popular.
Was it? Oh, okay.
Apparently it was really popular, and so yeah, I think it's all full of surprises. And you're right. So even the Sichuanese food that I ate as a student in Chengdu in the 1990s has evolved. There are new dishes, new fashions all the time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just also I'm thinking about aesthetics of the restaurants. The restaurant that I work at in downtown DC, Chang Chang, when I first walked in there, I thought this is what, nothing seemed abnormal about it. It's a very nicely decorated, very beautiful restaurant. But people walk in there and are constantly surprised that it's a Chinese restaurant because it doesn't have the dark, interior, the lanterns, but those kinds of restaurants don't exist in China.
I know there's a kind of convention, isn't there, of Chinatowns in the West.
Yeah.
But in China also, I mean, that's one of the very dramatic changes. So in the 1990s, most restaurants in Sichuan, they were very plain. I mean, they weren't decorated in any very interesting way. It was all very standard. And starting from the late 90s, the restaurant business has got so complex and competitive and diverse. And now, I mean, the last time I was in Beijing, the most beautiful restaurants, I mean, lavishly decorated and without any of those, conventional Chinatown things like bread and lanterns and all this sort of thing. Very much a sort of interesting mixtures of traditional references and very glamorous modernity. Yeah, I mean, it's hugely noticeable.
What about service? Do you ever think about how service is different at,
Yeah, so when I was first in Chengdu, I mean, of course, there were the little private restaurants around the university, which were very small businesses, and the service was sort of fine. But there were lots of very grumpy planned economy style service, grumpy waiters and waitresses and so on. And that's very much changed. And the service in the grandest restaurants in China is absolutely superb. Really, just
over the top?
Sorry, over the top. Yeah, over the top. Yeah, and actually, on my last trip, I went to one restaurant where I was in a private room with some friends and friends of friends having dinner, and there were three waitresses who were attending to our private room. And after dinner, they all did a dance routine in the room, which was obviously part of their job.
Oh, that's amazing. That's funny. So let's see. There's also a question about Xinjiang cooking. Is that the topic of your next cookbook? Is it something that you're interested in exploring, have explored?
Yeah, well, I have been there a couple of times. And the thing that's really interesting about it is that it's the bridge between classic Chinese cooking and Central Asian cooking. And so in Xinjiang, you get both kebabs, for example, and naan breads, which is something that you find across Central Asia all the way to the Mediterranean. And a lot of sheep meat, which again you find across Central Asia and across North China. But you also have hand-pulled noodles. which is something that you find all the way across the sort of wheat band of northern China, particularly. So it's a completely fascinating mix. And the words for foods in the Uyghur language often have Turkish or Persian roots. And they also use words from the Chinese language. So it is, I think it's a reminder that actually cuisines don't have borders at all, and that what you think of as Chinese food has been created not just by some very ancient indigenous traditions like fermenting soybeans and cutting food into little pieces, but also by centuries and millennia of trade. In the old days across the Silk Road, also influences from the Manchus and the Mongols to the north and the northeast, and the sea routes during the Ming Dynasty. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that struck me when I did my Silk Road journey was the dumplings, how that goes on from, all the way from Korea to China, all the way through to Italy and Turkey.
Yeah, and that's one of the chapters in the book. I think I wrote about the xiaolong bao. So the xiaolong bao, which is the little steamed soup dumpling, but actually in the region that it comes from, which is the region around Shanghai, it's known as a mantou. And this word mantou is used in the north of China for steamed breads these days, but used to refer to steamed breads and dumplings with fillings. Right. And it also, as you said, in Korea, the word mandu for dumpling, and all the languages all the way across to Turkey, where they have variations on manta or manti. With to describe various kinds of foods made from dough wrapped around a stuffing, usually meat, and it seems likely that the word mantou, which is a very common Chinese word, but is a strange word that doesn't, it looks, for various reasons, it looks like a foreign import, and it may actually come from an ancient Turkic language. And it's very interesting how that dumpling is something that clearly started in the north as a bready food, and it became daintier and lighter as it went south. So by the time it reaches Shanghai, you have these very dainty little dumplings with thin skins and, filled often with crab meat and very delicate little pinching. But it all tells this story of ancient historical migrations and trade routes and linguistic links across Central Asia.
Right, exactly. It is quite amazing the connections between all the cultures. So another person asked, do you have a favorite Cantonese dish? And I think I know what you're going to say, but
well, one of them I already mentioned, right? The xiazi yoki. So this is the braised pomelo pith with shrimp eggs, which I also write about in the book. And the reason I love it so much is partly because it's just really delicious and comforting. It's not a beautiful dish. It looks quite plain, but it's got this gorgeous texture and a really opulent, savory flavor. But the reason that it's a real favorite of mine is that it just expresses the genius and the creativity of Chinese cooking for me, because it starts with an ingredient that is so unpromising, the thick, cottony, slightly bitter pith of the pomelo, that giant citrus fruit, which most people would just throw in the bin, and indeed do throw in the bin. And yet Cantonese chefs have found a way of soaking it and squeezing it and getting rid of any bitterness, and then cooking it in this marvelous broth made from pork and toasted fish, and cooking it. So you end up with this delicacy that has a really profound savory flavor and a very comforting texture, a bit like mashed potato, but a bit softer and a bit sort of more sprightly.
I have never had it. It sounds amazing. I'm gonna have
well, next time you go to Hong Kong, and it's really delicious. And in fact, it seems to be, I've had it recently a couple of times served with a braised goose foot, which is cooked until it's really, the meat, the skin is falling off the bone, and in quite fancy restaurants as well. But that dish, I think it's just, one of the things I tried to write about, and one of the things that I find so extraordinary about Chinese food is this creativity and imagination. So that you look at something that you could cook, and instead of just saying, is this edible? Is this an ingredient? I think a Chinese chef is able to look at it and say, how can I make this edible? How could this be an ingredient? And so you can take something that's initially very unappealing, like jellyfish, which has no flavor or texture, maybe just a faintly unpleasant fishiness. And yet a Chinese chef can think, well, what does it have going for it? Well, it has this very brisk and exhilarating, slippery, crisp texture. Mm-hmm. And so then what am I going to do with it to use this? And so what a Chinese chef typically will do is to soak it and rinse it to get rid of any legacy of fishiness. So you end up with something that's pure texture. And then you add in the flavor, like some vinegar, some lovely vinegar, sesame oil, and then you add in some color to make it look more interesting, like some shredded cucumber. And so you take something that's nothing, that nobody else cooks, and you make it into a very refreshing and pleasing appetizer. So anyway, that's why I would choose braised pomelo pith, because it expresses that thoughtfulness of creativity.
I miss jellyfish in Shanghai in particular.
Yeah, that really crunchy, the jellyfish arms. Yeah,
in Shanghai with that. Here's another good question. Is there any particular style of Chinese food, regional food, that you think is underappreciated the way that Sichuan was and needs to be brought to the forefront now?
Well, I think most of them, in the sense that China is very big and has many exciting local cuisines. And although we see more of them in the West now, there's still so much more that we don't see. So, for example, Yunnan food. And I know there's a bit of Yunnan food around now, and you can get the lovely rice noodles, for example, I think in American cities and now in London. But the thing about Yunnan food is that it's a very exceptional province anyway, hugely diverse. So you've got everything from, in the northwest, you've got yak meat and sampa in the Tibetan areas. And in the far south, you have Sichuan, a tropical region with tropical rainforests, and where the food is very similar to Vietnamese, Laotian. It's just extraordinary. And but the thing about Yunnan is that it's also a global hotspot of biodiversity, as well as being culturally diverse. And there are many, many ingredients that you just can't get outside the region. Like, people eat different kinds of lichen and flowers and numerous wild mushrooms. Sorry?
Truffles.
Yeah, and
cheese.
Yeah, all these cheese, yes, I mean, amazingly, but all these ingredients that, and in Sichuan now, lots of spices that I don't know that you can get anywhere else. And so I think that's one place that you really have to go to. The other thing also is that in recent years, the Xi'an biang noodles have become very popular, and also the pulled noodles from Lanzhou with beef noodle soup. But these are just, again, the tip of the iceberg, because there are so many different types of pasta and pasta foods and things that I don't know whether they are exactly pastas or dumplings, or, it's a fascinating subject, particularly in Shanxi province in the north. Well, I know you wrote a lot about this. It's amazing. And people don't know anything about these pastas in the West. So I think the possibilities of exploring Chinese food are almost infinite. And there are some places, Sichuan, sorry,
something that will keep you busy for a very long time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Keep a lot of people busy.
Yeah.
Well, the bad news is that we are out of time, but the good news is
that
I popped in to promote some books.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so let's put this on the screen. So you can get invitation to a banquet or on the Noodle Road at the usual places you buy books, right?
I'm sure everyone will want both.
And thank you to Fuchsia Dunlop and Lin-Liu. This program is made possible through the support of the Ruth H. Kuo and Rhoda Howe Memorial Foundation and the Chinese American Museum, DC, and viewers like you. So thank you so much. I will point out that I have not eaten dinner yet. So this was a good pre-course to that.
Great. Fuchsia,
Thank you.
pleasure talking to you as usual, and good luck with your next cookbook, and we'll be waiting for it.
Thanks, Jen. Lovely talking to you too. And thanks, David. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Good night.